Section 35 of Manners, Customs and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Manners, Customs and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul LaCroix. Section 35. As we approach the 14th century, an epoch of the Middle Ages at which, after many changes of fashion and many struggles against the ancient Roman and German traditions, modern national costume seems at last to have assumed a settled and normal character, we think it right to recapitulate somewhat, with a view to set forth the nature of the various elements which were at work from time to time in forming the fashions in dress. In order to give more weight to our remarks, we will extract almost word for word a few pages from the learned and excellent work which M. Jules Quicherat has published on this subject. Towards the year 1280, he says, quote, "The dress of a man, not of a man as the word was then used, which meant serf, but of one to whom the exercise of human prerogatives was permitted, that is to say, of an ecclesiastic, a bourgeois, or a noble, was composed of 6 indispensable portions: the bray, or breeches, the stockings, the shoes, the coat, the surcoat, or cotte hardie, and the chaperon, or headdress. To these articles, those who wished to dress more elegantly added on the body a shirt, on the shoulders a mantle, and on the head a hat or fronteau. The bray, B-R-A-I-E-S, or B-R-A-Y-E-S, were a kind of drawers, generally knitted, sometimes made of woolen stuff or silk, and sometimes even of undressed leather. Our ancestors derived this part of their dress from the ancient Gauls. Only the Gallic bray came down to the ankle, whereas those of the 13th century only reached to the calf. They were fastened above the hips by means of a belt called the braillet. By chausses was meant what we now call long stockings or hose. The stockings were of the same colour and material as the bray, and were kept up by the lower part of the bray being pulled over them and tied with a string. The shoes were made of various kinds of leather, the quality of which depended on the way in which they were tanned, and were either of common leather, or of leather which was similar to that we know as Morocco, and was called cordouan or cordua, hence the derivation of the word cordouanier, which has now become cordonnier. Shoes were generally made pointed. This fashion of the poulaine, or Polish points, was followed throughout the whole of Europe for nearly 300 years, and when first introduced, the Church was so scandalized by it that it was almost placed in the catalogue of heresies. Subsequently, the taste respecting the exaggerated length of the points was somewhat modified, but it had become so inveterate that the tendency for pointed shoes returning to their former absurd extremes was constantly showing itself. The pointed shoes became gradually longer during the struggles which were carried on in the reign of Philippe le Bel between Church and State. Besides the shoes, there were also the estiviaux, thus named from estiva, summer thing, because, being generally made of velvet, brocade, or other costly material, they could only be worn in dry weather. The coat, cotte, corresponded with the tunic of the ancients. It was a blouse with tight sleeves. These sleeves were the only part of it which were exposed, the rest being completely covered by the surcoats, or cotte hardie, a name the origin of which is obscure. In shape, the surcoat somewhat resembled a sack, in which, at a later period, large slits were made in the arms, as well as over the hips and on the chest, through which appeared the rich furs and satins with which it was lined. The ordinary material of the surcoat for the rich was cloth, either scarlet, blue, or reddish brown, or 2 or more of these colours mixed together, and for the poor, linsey-woolsey or fustian. The nobles, princes, or barons, when holding a court, wore surcoats of a colour to match their arms, which were embroidered upon them, but the lesser nobles who frequented the houses of the great spoke of themselves as in the robes of such and such a noble, because he whose patronage they courted was obliged to provide them with surcoats and mantles. These were of their patron's favourite colour, and were called the livery, livret, on account of their distribution, livraison, which took place twice a year. The word has remained in use ever since, but with a different signification. It is, however, so nearly akin to the original meaning that its affinity is evident. End quote. An interesting anecdote relative to this custom is to be found in the chronicles of Matthew Paris. When St. Louis, to the dismay of all his vassals and of his inferior servants, had decided to take up the cross, he succeeded in associating the nobles of his court with him in his vow by a kind of pious fraud. Having had a certain number of mantles prepared for Christmas Day, he had a small white cross embroidered on each above the right shoulder, and ordered them to be distributed among the nobles on the morning of the feast, when they were about to go to mass, which was celebrated some time before sunrise. Each courtier received the mantle given by the king at the door of his room, and put it on in the dark, without noticing the white cross. But when the day broke, to his great surprise, he saw the emblem worn by his neighbour, without knowing that he himself wore it also. They were surprised and amused, says the English historian, quote, at finding that the king had thus piously entrapped them. As it would have been unbecoming, shameful, and even unworthy of them to have removed these crosses, they laughed heartily, and said that the good king, on starting as a pilgrim hunter, had found a new method of catching men. End quote. The chaperon, adds Monsieur Quicherat, quote, was the national headdress of the ancient French, as the cucullus, which was its model, was that of the Gauls. We can imagine its appearance by its resemblance to the domino now worn at masked balls. The shape was much varied during the reign of Philippe le Bel, either by the diminution of the cape or by the lengthening of the hood, which was always sufficiently long to fall on the shoulders. In the first of these changes, the chaperon no longer being tied round the neck, required to be held on the head by something more solid. For this reason it was set on a pad or roll, which changed it into a regular cap. The material was so stitched as to make it take certain folds, which were arranged as puffs, as ruffs, or in the shape of a cock's comb. This last fashion, called cockade, was especially in vogue. Hence the origin of the French epithet coquard, which would be now expressed by the word dandy. Hats were of various shapes. They were made of different kinds of felt, or of otter or goat's skin, or of wool or cotton. The expression chapeau de fleurs, hat of flowers, which continually occurs in ancient works, did not mean any form of hat, but simply a coronet of forget-me-nots or roses, which was an indispensable part of dress for balls or festivities down to the reign of Philippe de Valois, 1347. Frontlets, fronteaux, a species of fillet made of silk, covered with gold and precious stones, superseded the chapeau de fleurs, inasmuch as they had the advantage of not fading. They also possessed the merit of being much more costly, and were thus the means of establishing in a still more marked manner distinctions in the social positions of the wearers. There were two kinds of mantles. One was open in front and fell over the back, and a strap which crossed the chest held it fixed on the shoulders. The other, enveloping the body like a bell, was slit up on the right side, and was thrown back over the left arm. It was made with a fur collar, cut in the shape of a tippet. This last has been handed down to us, and is worn by our judges under the name of toge and épitoge. It is a very common mistake to suppose that the shirt is an article of dress of modern invention. On the contrary, it is one of great antiquity, and its coming into general use is the only thing new about it. Lastly, we have to mention the chape, which was always regarded as a necessary article of dress. The chape was the only protection against bad weather at a period when umbrellas and covered carriages were unknown. It was sometimes called chape de pluie, on account of the use to which it was applied, and it consisted of a large cape with sleeves, and was completely waterproof. It was borne behind a master by his servant, who, on account of this service, was called a porte-chape. It is needless to say that the common people carried it themselves, either slung over their backs or folded under the arm." End quote. If we now turn to female attire, we shall find represented in it all the component parts of male dress, and almost all of them under the same names. It must be remarked, however, that the women's coats and surcoats often trailed on the ground, that the hat, which was generally called a couvre-chef, and consisted of a frame of wirework covered over with stuff which was embroidered or trimmed with lace, was not of a conical shape. And lastly, that the chaperon, which was always made with a tippet or chausse, never turned over so as to form a cap. We may add that the use of the couvre-chef did not continue beyond the middle of the 14th century, at which time women adopted the custom of wearing any kind of headdress they chose, the hair being kept back by a silken net, or crépine, attached either to a frontlet or to a metal fillet, or confined by a veil of very light material called a mollequin. With the aid of our learned guide, we have now reached a period, end of the 13th century, well adapted for this general study of the dress of our ancestors, inasmuch as soon afterwards men's dress at least, and especially that of young courtiers, became most ridiculously and even indecently exaggerated. To such an extent was this the case that, serious calamities having befallen the French nation about this time, and its fashions having exercised a considerable influence over the whole continent of Europe, contemporary historians do not hesitate to regard these public misfortunes as a providential chastisement inflicted on France for its disgraceful extravagance in dress. "We must believe that God has permitted this as a just judgment on us for our sins," say the monks who edited the Grande Chronique de Saint-Denis in 1346, at the time of the unfortunate battle of Crécy, "although it does not belong to us to judge. But what we see we testify to, for pride was very great in France, and especially amongst the nobles and others, that is to say, pride of nobility and covetousness. There was also much impropriety in dress, and this extended throughout the whole of France. Some had their clothes so short and so tight that it required the help of 2 persons to dress and undress them, and whilst they were being undressed, they appeared as if they were being skinned. Others wore dresses plaited over their loins, like women. Some had chaperons cut out in points all round, some had tippets of one cloth, others of another, and some had their head-dresses and sleeves reaching to the ground, looking more like mountebanks than anything else. Considering all this, it is not surprising if God employed the King of England as a scourge to correct the excesses of the French people." End quote. And this is not the only testimony to the ridiculous and extravagant tastes of this unfortunate period. One writer speaks with indignation of the goats' beards with 2 points, which seemed to put the last finishing touch of ridicule on the already grotesque appearance of even the most serious people of that period. Another exclaims against the extravagant luxury of jewels, of gold and silver, and against the wearing of feathers, which latter then appeared for the first time as accessories to both male and female attire. Some censure, and not without reason, the absurd fashion of converting the ancient leather girdle, meant to support the waist, into a kind of heavy padded band, studded with gilded ornaments and precious stones, and apparently invented expressly to encumber the person wearing it. Other contemporary writers, and amongst these Pope Urban V and King Charles V, inveigh against the poulaines, which had more than ever come into favour, and which were only considered correct in fashion when they were made as a kind of appendix to the foot, measuring at least double its length, and ornamented in the most fantastical manner. The Pope anathematized this deformity as "a mockery of God and the Holy Church," and the king forbade craftsmen to make them, and his subjects to wear them. All this is as nothing in comparison with the profuse extravagance displayed in furs, which was most outrageous and ruinous, and of which we could not form an idea were it not for the items in certain royal documents, from which we gather that, in order to trim 2 complete suits for King John, no fewer than 670 marten skins were used. It is also stated that the Duke of Berry, the youngest son of that monarch, purchased nearly 10,000 of these same skins from a distant country in the north, in order to trim only 5 mantles and as many surcoats. We read also that a robe made for the Duke of Orléans, grandson of the same king, required 2,790 ermine skins. It is unnecessary to state that in consequence of this large consumption, skins could only be purchased at the most extravagant prices. For example, 50 skins cost about 100 francs, or about 6,000 of present currency, showing to what an enormous expense those persons were put who desired to keep pace with the luxury of the times. We have already seen that Charles V used his influence, which was unfortunately very limited, in trying to restrain the extravagance of fashion. This monarch did more than decree laws against indelicate or unseemly and ridiculous dress. He himself never wore anything but the long and ample costume, which was most becoming, and which had been adopted in the preceding century. His example, it is true, was little followed, but it nevertheless had this happy result, that the advocates of short and tight dresses, as if suddenly seized with instinctive modesty, adopted an upper garment, the object of which seemed to be to conceal the absurd fashions which they had not the courage to rid themselves of. This heavy and ungraceful tunic, called a housse, consisted of 2 broad bands of a more or less costly material, which, starting from the neck, fell behind and before, thus almost entirely concealing the front and back of the person, and only allowing the undergarments to be seen through the slits which naturally opened on each side of it. A fact worthy of remark is that whilst male attire, through a depravity of taste, had extended to the utmost limit of extravagance, women's dress, on the contrary, owing to a strenuous effort towards a dignified and elegant simplicity, became of such a character that it combined all the most approved fashions of female costume which had been in use in former periods. The statue of Queen Jeanne de Bourbon, wife of Charles V, formerly placed with that of her husband in the Church of the Célestins at Paris, gives the most faithful representation of this charming costume, to which our artists continually have recourse when they wish to depict any poetical scenes of the French Middle Ages. This costume, without positively differing in style from that of the 13th century, inasmuch as it was composed of similar elements, was nevertheless to be distinguished by a degree of elegance which hitherto had been unknown. The coat or undergarment, which formerly only showed itself through awkwardly contrived openings, now displayed the harmonious outlines of the figure to advantage, thanks to the large openings in the overcoat. The surcoat, kept back on the shoulders by 2 narrow bands, became a sort of wide and trailing skirt, which majestically draped the lower part of the body. And lastly, the external corset was invented, which was a kind of short mantle, falling down before and behind, without concealing any of the fine outlines of the bust. This new article of apparel, which was kept in its place in the middle of the chest by a steel busk encased in some rich lacework, was generally made of fur in winter and of silk in summer. If we consult the numerous miniatures in manuscripts of this period, in which the gracefulness of the costume was heightened by the colours employed, we shall understand what variety and what richness of effect could be displayed without departing from the most rigid simplicity. One word more in reference to female headdress. The fashion of wearing false hair continued in great favour during the middle of the 14th century, and it gave rise to all sorts of ingenious combinations, which, however, always admitted of the hair being parted from the forehead to the back of the head in two equal masses, and of being plaited or waved over the ears. Nets were again adopted, and headdresses which, whilst permitting a display of masses of false hair, hid the horsehair or padded puffs. And lastly, the escoffion appeared, a heavy roll which, being placed on a cap also padded, produced the most clumsy, outrageous, and ungraceful shapes. At the beginning of the 15th century, men's dress was still very short. It consisted of a kind of tight waistcoat fastened by tags, and of very close-fitting breeches, which displayed the outlines of the figure. In order to appear wide at the shoulders, artificial pads were worn, called mahoitres. The hair was allowed to fall on the forehead in locks, which covered the eyebrows and eyes. The sleeves were slashed, the shoes armed with long metal points, and the conical hat, with turned-up rim, was ornamented with gold chains and various jewels. The ladies, during the reign of Charles VI., still wore long trains to their dresses, which they carried tucked up under their arms, unless they had pages or waiting-maids. See chapter on ceremonials. The tendency, however, was to shorten these inconvenient trains, as well as the long-hanging and embroidered or fringed sleeves. On the other hand, ladies' dresses on becoming shorter were trimmed in the most costly manner. Their headdresses consisted of very large rolls, surmounted by a high conical bonnet, called a hennin, the introduction of which into France was attributed to Queen Isabel of Bavaria, wife of Charles VI. It was at this period that they began to uncover the neck and to wear necklaces. Under Louis XI., this costume, already followed and adopted by the greatest slaves of fashion, became more general. In this year, 1487, says the chronicler Monstrelet, quote, "Ladies ceased to wear trains, substituting for them trimmings of grebe, of marten's fur, of velvet, and of other materials, of about 18 inches in width. Some wore on the top of their heads rolls nearly 2 feet high, shaped like a round cap, which closed in above. Others wore them lower, with veils hanging from the top and reaching down to the feet. Others wore unusually wide silk bands, with very elegant buckles equally wide, and magnificent gold necklaces of various patterns." About this time, too, men took to wearing shorter clothes than ever, having them made to fit tightly to the body, after the manner of dressing monkeys, which was very shameful and immodest, and the sleeves of their coats and doublets were slit open so as to show their fine white shirts. They wore their hair so long that it concealed their face and even their eyes, and on their heads they wore cloth caps nearly a foot or more high. They also carried, according to fancy, very splendid gold chains. Knights and squires, and even the varlets, wore silk or velvet doublets, and almost every one, especially at court, wore poulaines 9 inches or more in length. They also wore under their doublets large pads, mahoitres, in order to appear as if they had broad shoulders." End quote. Under Charles VIII, the mantle, trimmed with fur, was open in front, its false sleeves being slit up above in order to allow the arms of the undercoat to pass through. The cap was turned up, the breeches or long hose were made tight-fitting. The shoes with poulaines were superseded by a kind of large padded shoe of black leather, round or square at the toes, and gored over the foot with coloured material, a fashion imported from Italy, and which was as much exaggerated in France as the poulaine had formerly been. The women continued to wear conical caps, hennin, of great height, covered with immense veils. Their gowns were made with tight-fitting bodies, which thus displayed the outlines of the figure. Under Louis XII, Queen Anne invented a low headdress, or rather it was invented for her, consisting of strips of velvet or of black or violet silk over other bands of white linen, which encircled the face and fell down over the back and shoulders. The large sleeves of the dresses had a kind of turned-over borders, with trimmings of enormous width. Men adopted short tunics, plaited and tight at the waist. The upper part of the garments of both men and women was cut in the form of a square over the chest and shoulders, as most figures are represented in the pictures of Raphael and contemporary painters. The introduction of Italian fashions, which in reality did not much differ from those which had been already adopted, but which exhibited better taste and a greater amount of elegance, dates from the famous expedition of Charles VIII into Italy. Full and gathered or puffed sleeves, which gave considerable gracefulness to the upper part of the body, succeeded to the mahoitres, which had been discarded since the time of Louis XI. A short and ornamental mantle, a broad-brimmed hat covered with feathers, and trunk hose, the ample dimensions of which earned for them the name of trousse, formed the male attire at the end of the 15th century. Women wore the bodies of their dresses closely fitting to the figure, embroidered, trimmed with lace, and covered with gilt ornaments. The sleeves were very large and open, and for the most part they still adhered to the heavy and ungraceful headdress of Queen Anne of Brittany. The principal characteristic of female dress at the time was its fulness. Men's, on the contrary, with the exception of the mantle or the upper garment, was usually tight and very scanty. We find that a distinct separation between ancient and modern dress took place as early as the 16th century. In fact, our present fashions may be said to have taken their origin from about that time. It was during this century that men adopted clothes closely fitting to the body, overcoats with tight sleeves, felt hats with more or less wide brims, and closed shoes and boots. The women also wore their dresses closely fitting to the figure, with tight sleeves, low-crowned hats, and richly trimmed petticoats. These garments, which differ altogether from those of antiquity, constitute, as it were, the common type from which have since arisen the endless varieties of male and female dress. And there is no doubt that fashion will thus be continually changing backwards and forwards from time to time, sometimes returning to its original model and sometimes departing from it. During the 16th century, ladies wore the skirts of their dresses, which were tight at the waist and open in front, very wide, displaying the lower part of a very rich under petticoat, which reached to the ground, completely concealing the feet. This, like the sleeves with puffs, which fell in circles to the wrists, was altogether an Italian fashion. Frequently the hair was turned over in rolls and adorned with precious stones, and was surmounted by a small cap, coquettishly placed either on one side or on the top of the head, and ornamented with gold chains, jewels, and feathers. The body of the dress was always long and pointed in front. Men wore their coats cut somewhat after the same shape. Their trunk hose were tight, but round the waist they were puffed out. They wore a cloak which only reached as far as the hips, and was always much ornamented. They carried a smooth or ribbed cap on one side of the head, and a small upright collar adorned the coat. This collar was replaced, after the first half of the 16th century, by the high starched ruff, which was kept out by wires. Ladies wore it still larger, when it had somewhat the appearance of an open fan at the back of the neck. If we take a retrospective glance at the numerous changes of costume which we have endeavoured to describe in this hurried sketch, we shall find that amongst European nations during the Middle Ages there was but one common standard of fashion, which varied from time to time according to the particular custom of each country, and according to the peculiarities of each race. In Italy, for instance, dress always maintained a certain character of grandeur, ever recalling the fact that the influence of antiquity was not quite lost. In Germany and Switzerland, garments had generally a heavy and massive appearance. In Holland, still more so. England uniformly studied a kind of instinctive elegance and propriety. It is a curious fact that Spain invariably partook of the heaviness peculiar to Germany, either because the Gothic element still prevailed there, or that the Walloon fashions had a special attraction to her, owing to associations and general usage. France was then, as it is now, fickle and capricious, fantastical and wavering, but not from indifference, but because she was always ready to borrow from every quarter anything which pleased her. She, however, never failed to put her own stamp on whatever she adopted, thus making any fashion essentially French, even though she had only just borrowed it from Spain, England, Germany, or Italy. In all these countries we have seen, and still see, entire provinces adhering to some ancient costume, causing them to differ altogether in character from the rest of the nation. This is simply owing to the fact that the fashions have become obsolete in the neighbouring places, for every local costume faithfully and rigorously preserved by any community at a distance from the centre of political action or government must have been originally brought there by the nobles of the country. Thus the headdress of Anne of Brittany is still that of the peasant women of Penhoë and of Labrevac, and the hennin of Isabel of Bavaria is still the headdress of Normandy. Although the subject has reached the limits we have, by the very nature of this work, assigned to it, we think it well to overstep them somewhat, in order briefly to indicate the last connecting link between modern fashions and those of former periods. Under Francis I, the costumes adopted from Italy remained almost stationary. Under Henri II, and especially after the death of that prince, the taste for frivolities made immense progress, and the style of dress in ordinary use seemed day by day to lose the few traces of dignity which it had previously possessed. Catherine de' Medici had introduced into France the fashion of ruffs, and at the beginning of the 14th century Marie de' Medici that of small collars. Dresses tight at the waist began to be made very full round the hips by means of large padded rolls, and these were still more enlarged under the name of vertugadin, corrupted from vertu gardien, by a monstrous arrangement of padded whalebone and steel, which subsequently became the ridiculous paniers, which were worn almost down to the commencement of the present century, and the fashion seems likely to come into vogue again. Under the last of the Valois, men's dress was short, the jacket was pointed and trimmed round with small peaks, the velvet cap was trimmed with aigrettes, the beard was pointed, a pearl hung from the left ear, and a small cloak or mantle was carried on the shoulder, which only reached to the waist. The use of gloves, made of scented leather, became universal. Ladies wore their dresses long, very full, and very costly, little or no change being made in these respects during the reign of Henry IV. At this period the men's high hose were made longer and fuller, especially in Spain and the Low Countries, and the fashion of large soft boots, made of doeskin or of black morocco, became universal on account of their being so comfortable. We may remark that the costume of the bourgeois was for a long time almost unchanged, even in the towns. Never having adopted either the tight-fitting hose or the balloon trousers, they wore an easy jerkin, a large cloak, and a felt hat, which the English made conical and with a broad brim. Towards the beginning of the 17th century, the high hose which were worn by the northern nations, profusely trimmed, was transformed into the culotte, which was full and open at the knees. A division was thus suddenly made between the lower and the upper part of the hose, as if the garment which covered the lower limbs had been cut in two, and garters were then necessarily invented. The felt hat became over almost the whole of Europe a cap, taking the exact form of the head, and having a wide flat brim turned up on one side. High heels were added to boots and shoes, which up to that time had been flat and with single soles. 2 centuries later, a terrible social agitation took place all over Europe, after which male attire became mean, ungraceful, plain, and more paltry than ever, whereas female dress, the fashions of which were perpetually changing from day to day, became graceful and elegant, though too often approaching to the extravagant and absurd. End of section 35, and end of Manners, Customs, and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul LaCroix.